Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely bold framework from our source material. We're looking at the concept of Saturn devouring his children, and how we can actually use ancient mythology to decode modern systemic trauma.
So why do some systems literally devour their own future? It's a striking question, right? And it's actually the primary diagnostic lens we'll be using today. The sources we're looking at propose that instead of nurturing the next generation, in our families, businesses, or legal institutions, a lot of our modern systems are actually engineered to consume them. To figure out how and why this is happening, the material points us to a deeply visceral image from Roman mythology, the myth of Saturn.
Now, if you're into mythology, you probably know Saturn. He's the Titan who was so terrified of a prophecy saying his own kids would overthrow him that he literally swallowed them whole right after they were born. But the sources argue this isn't just some dusty old story. It's actually a profound, living metaphor for highly competitive, destructive dynamics in our society today. It represents an environment where the people in power look at the emerging generation not as a legacy to be fostered, but as a direct threat that needs to be neutralized.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the sources link that ancient, terrifying mythological imagery directly to a modern psychological block, arrested development. You see, this happens when unresolved generational trauma basically halts emotional evolution. Instead of the older generation acting with grace and support, they get locked in this state of arrested development, actively competing with the youth. And that translates into a societal architecture that prioritizes its own immediate survival and power over the healthy development of the people coming next.
So what does this actually look like in the real world? The sources outline a few specific symptoms of what they call the Saturnian state. Right at the top of the list, a massive systemic evasion of responsibility. It's like nobody wants to be held accountable anymore. We see this popping up in subjective legal systems, especially family law, that end up stripping people of their autonomy. The material also points to interpersonal manipulation, like spiritual abuse in unregulated plant medicine communities, and even the weaponization of everyday social tools, like using music in certain settings to coerce consent. The common thread running through the whole shebang is a total evasion of accountability from the top down.
There's a quote from the source material that really captures the deep frustration with all of this. It describes an environment completely defined by avoidance and the literal liquidation of families. That is a powerful critique. It's targeting institutions that prioritize dodging liability over protecting human autonomy. Think about it. When systems are built just to protect themselves from risk, they become fundamentally Saturnian. They devour the human element and break down family bonds just to keep their own structural power intact.
So where do we go from here? Let's take a look at the archetypal evolution and how we move from a state of consumption to one of true nurturance.
Let's move to the next phase and see how this builds. This maps out a really necessary evolutionary upgrade in human consciousness. Phase 1 is Saturn, seeing the next generation as competition and, well, devouring them. Phase 2 introduces Zeus, the guy who overthrew Saturn. Zeus represents a shift toward guarding and protecting the youth, which is better, but that energy is still flawed and often pretty authoritarian. Finally, we get Phase 3, which is the leap to eternal love. This is an archetype of unconditional nurturance, where the father figure fully supports the child's growth with zero fear of being replaced.
When we compare these two fundamental mindsets, the contrast is pretty sharp. On one hand, the Saturnian mindset operates entirely from a place of scarcity and fear. To them, the next generation is pure competition. On the other hand, the eternal father mindset operates from abundance and love, viewing the next generation as a legacy. The sources argue that actively pursuing this evolution to higher archetypes acts as a necessary life raft for managing unresolved generational trauma and finally stopping the cycle of abuse.
To ground this evolution in history, the source material points to the introduction of Christian theology as a crucial archetypal upgrade for mankind. Regardless of personal beliefs, they argue this historical shift provided a framework to move past that fiercely protective but deeply flawed Zeus energy. It introduced a model where fathers are called to unconditionally love and nurture their sons, fundamentally changing the sociological dynamic from fierce competition to mutual care and legacy building.
Now we absolutely have to move from theory to action. Let's talk about breaking the cycle and transcending this Saturn state.
Before we can fix it, the source material poses a really critical warning. Are we actually moving backwards? Ask yourself, are our current legal, social, and technological systems actively regressing by consuming their own future? The sources argue that excessive guardrails,
the ones that infantilize people and shield them from the natural consequences of reality, are actually a modern manifestation of Saturn. By stripping away personal accountability, these systems are essentially devouring the autonomy and the potential of the next generation.
To combat this regression, the sources propose a really fascinating philosophical framework. They call it the shadow work role swap. The argument here is that if society is ever going to be liberated from destructive conflict, traditional modes of inner psychological work, what's often called shadow work, need to be flipped. The proposal suggests that men should focus intensely on overcoming self-hatred, while women should engage in shadow work regarding destructive or even murderous intent. According to the text, taking this collective swapped approach to psychological healing is a strict prerequisite for real societal transformation. Moving beyond internal psychological work, the sources break down 3 distinct, actionable steps for society to move past this evasive Saturnian state. Step 1 is simple but incredibly difficult. We must acknowledge and bear witness to the raw pain of the individual. We have to stop the avoidance. Step 2 requires establishing a restorative healing circle right around that acknowledged pain. And step 3 is structural. We absolutely must implement objective, deterministic legal frameworks to ensure these systemic abuses cannot happen to the next generation.
So the crucial point is how the source frames this 3rd step. They call this systematic pursuit of objective rules, a new 5th wave approach to justice. This isn't about subjective interpretation or a legal system that arbitrarily changes based on who happens to be in power. Not at all. It's about building highly deterministic, neutral frameworks, kind of like rigorous computer architecture or formal mathematics. In this model, the rules are totally transparent, objective, and they actively protect the individual from systemic overreach.
This perfectly summarizes the ultimate choice facing our society right now. We can choose to remain in the regressive Saturnian state, which is basically a subjective house of mirrors characterized by avoidance, liability dodging, and systemic trauma. Or we can choose to build the transcendent society, a system built on the brave acknowledgement of human pain, governed by objective rules, and aimed squarely at genuine lasting reconciliation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core thesis of our source material. True, radical personal accountability is literally the only way to stop massive systems from liquidating families and devouring the future. It's about tearing down those excessive, infantilizing guardrails we talked about and allowing individuals the dignity of both profound autonomy and profound responsibility.
So, we'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to reflect on. Look at the institutions you interact with every single day, in business, in law, in technology. Ask yourself, are we building a foundation for the next generation? Or are we simply consuming them just to maintain the current power structure? The myth of Saturn is thousands of years old, but as our sources reveal, its warning has absolutely never been more urgent. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you in the next explainer.